It all started with a phone call. The old phone on the kitchen wall rang at 7 o'clock sharp. I wiped my hands on my apron and picked it up, feeling the familiar tingle in my fingertips. Somehow, I always knew when Roy was calling. Mom, we're in trouble. His voice sounded hoarse, like he'd just run a mile. We're being evicted. I covered my eyes. It was the fourth time in the last 3 years. Or was it the fifth? I'd already lost count. What happened this time? That bloodsucker Mortensen raised the rent $70. 70. Where did we get that kind of money? His voice was the usual mixture of outrage and helplessness. I knew it wasn't just the rent increase. Roy couldn't hold a job for longer than 3 months. I need my freedom, Mom, he'd say, when I gently tried to hint at his irresponsibility. And Debbie, his wife, though she worked at a dry cleaner's on Broadway, spent half of her earnings on her little joys, as she called them, her shoes, purses, and perfume that sat unopened for weeks. Can we stay at your place? Roy asked, as if asking to borrow a cup of sugar. Just for a little while, until we find a new place to live. Just a couple weeks. I looked at my cozy little kitchen. 3 years ago, I finally paid the last installment on this house. For 30 years, I'd been saving $10 a month, working as a teller at the Yankton Savings Bank. After Delbert, my husband, died, this house became my only solace. For 2 years, I'd spent 2 years fixing it up to my liking. Light-colored curtains, an antique sideboard inherited from my mother, a collection of china bells on a shelf. It was just the way I wanted it. Of course, son, I said, knowing that I was expected to say no other. They arrived the next morning when the sun was just rising over the roofs of the neighboring houses. Roy's old pickup stopped on my porch, screeching its brakes so hard that Mrs. Haywood looked out the window from across the street. The whole family, Roy, Debbie, and the two kids, Cody and Shayla, poured out of the car. They were followed by suitcases, boxes, bags, and, surprise, surprise, a hamster cage. Hi, Ma. Roy hugged me with one arm, smelling of cigarettes and something sour. We won't be long, I promise. Debbie walked past me without even saying hello, heading straight for the back of the house. This room will be ours, I heard her voice from the guest bedroom, where I kept my needlework and photo albums. The kids, Cody and Shayla, ages 16 and 14, looked at me without much interest. I tried to hug my grandson, but he deftly dodged and mumbled something about his stuff in the car. Grandma, do you have internet? Shayla asked, keeping her eyes on the phone. I do, honey, but it's really slow, I said, trying to hide my disappointment at seeing him like this. Shit, she said, rolling her eyes, and followed my brother. By noon, my house was unrecognizable. Boxes and bags of stuff piled up in the hallway. On the kitchen table, where I usually drank my morning tea, was a huge TV that Roy had plugged in without asking permission. My sewing table had been taken out of the guest bedroom, and now it stood orphaned in the corner of the garage, covered with an old quilt. Mom, we need a place to put the kids' stuff. Debbie looked into my bedroom, appraising the closet. Maybe you could move some of your stuff into the dresser. I nodded, though something inside me clenched. My closet, like the rest of the house, had always been perfectly organized. Everything had its place. Every shelf was neatly covered with embroidered doilies. Now it was all disturbed by the presence of a stranger. That night we had dinner all together at my kitchen table, sliding the TV to the side. I made chicken and vegetable stew, a dish Roy had loved as a child. Mom, can you watch Shayla tomorrow? I have a shift at the dry cleaners, and she needs to go to those, what's his name? Art class, Debbie said without looking at me, concentrating on cutting up the chicken on her plate. I'm not 5 years old. I can drive myself, Shayla snorted. Of course I can drive her, I said, excited to spend time with my granddaughter. And, Ma, Roy interjected, we need to get something from the vault. I'll take your car tomorrow, okay? My old Honda was my pride. I bought it when I retired, and I cherished it like the apple of my eye. Roy wrecked cars twice when he was younger. Okay, just be careful, I said, feeling the words stick in my throat. I couldn't sleep for a long time that night. There was loud music coming from the kids' room and from the living room, the sound of the TV, where Roy was watching some sports event. My quiet home, my sanctuary, was filled with other people's sounds, smells, and habits. It's only for a couple weeks, I reassured myself, looking up at the ceiling. They'll find a new place to live soon. But as the days went by, nothing changed. Roy would leave early in the morning, ostensibly to look for work, and return late at night, often smelling of beer. Debbie worked shifts, and on her free days occupied the bathroom for hours, dyeing her hair or taking a bath with my supply of salt, which I saved for special occasions. The kids settled in quickly, turning the house into a sort of youth club. Cody would bring friends who would sit in the living room with cans of beer, even though he was only 16, laughing loudly and leaving behind crumbs and empty cans. Shayla was always on the phone, locked in the bathroom, which sometimes made me have to wait half an hour just to wash up. A week later, Roy brought more stuff from storage, a huge leather couch that took up almost the entire living room, forcing me to move my favorite rocking chair to a corner where it got almost no light. There was another TV, a stereo system, and some kind of exercise equipment that had been placed in the garage, completely displacing my gardening equipment. Mom, we were thinking, Roy said one evening, sprawled out on the new couch. Maybe you could let us redo the back room. You know, the one you're using as a closet. Cody needs his own space. He's 16 now. The back room was my sanctuary. I kept all my memorabilia there. The wedding dress in a special case, photo albums, Delbert's old letters from his military service, childhood drawings of Roy and his sister Leslie. But it won't be for long, I said quietly. You'll find an apartment soon enough. Yeah, sure. Roy waved his hand, keeping his eyes on the TV. But for now, we need a place to stay. You don't want your grandson sleeping on the floor, do you? And I relented. You always do. Roy and I moved all the boxes and memorabilia into the attic, climbing the narrow stairs again and again. At my 67 years of age, each climb was difficult, but I didn't complain. The next day, Cody had already taken over the room, hanging posters of musicians and athletes on the walls. My cream-colored wallpaper, so lovingly chosen, was now barely visible. 2 weeks turned into a month. During that time, Roy went to interviews twice, and both times came back with stories of why the job was not for him. Debbie started inviting her friends from the dry cleaners, and now there were often 3 or 4 women sitting in my kitchen in the evenings, loudly discussing their bosses and neighbors, smoking in the house, even though I had repeatedly asked her not to. Mom, don't be such a baby. Roy waved me away when I gently reminded him of my allergy to tobacco smoke. Open the window if you're stuffy. I began to feel like a guest in my own home. My dishes were disappearing into the bowels of the sink, piled with dirty plates that no one was in a hurry to wash. My clean towels would end up on the bathroom floor. My groceries disappeared from the refrigerator without warning. One day, I came home from the store and found my rocking chair gone from the living room. We took it up to the attic, Roy explained when I asked. We needed a place for the game console. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time that night, looking at my hands, the hands that had worked tirelessly for 30 years to create this house, the hands that stroked little Roy's head when he had a fever, the hands that had held Delbert in his last days. And now those hands were powerless to protect even my little world. Week after week, my house became more and more their home. My habits and preferences were pushed aside, giving way to their way of life. I started going to bed earlier so I wouldn't hear the noise. I started eating breakfast before they woke up so I could drink my tea in peace. I started spending more time with my neighbor, Nora Haywood, who understood everything without words and just poured me coffee when I came in looking lost. By the end of the second month, I was almost resigned, almost convinced myself that this was even better. There was life in the house, movement, family close by. But sometimes, when I woke up in the middle of the night, I would walk out into the dark living room and stand in the middle of the room, not recognizing it. Stranger things, stranger smells, stranger habits. And somewhere deep inside, a realization was growing. This was no longer my home. On Wednesday, I went shopping. It was my weekly ritual. Every Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock, I visited the Foodway supermarket on the corner of Maple Street and 4th Avenue. 30 years of the same schedule. The grocery list written in neat handwriting on the back of the bill envelope. The cart with the squeaking right wheel. The familiar aisles between the shelves. This time I lingered longer than usual. First, I met Edna Perkins, my former colleague from the bank, and we spent a good 20 minutes discussing her new twin grandchildren. Then I had to wait for the butcher to cut my roast beef. Roy liked roast beef sandwiches for lunch. I tried to be happy that I was cooking for the family again, even though no one but me was clearing the table or washing the dishes after the meal. When I finally left the store, the clock on the town tower showed the beginning of the second. I'd never gotten home this late on Wednesdays. Perhaps that's why what happened next caught me so off guard. As I approached the house, I noticed immediately that something had changed. The new doorknob gleamed in the sunlight, chrome and intricately patterned. Not at all like my old brass knob, polished to a shine by years of touching it. I stopped for a moment, catching my breath after climbing the porch steps, and pulled my keys out of my purse. The key wouldn't go into the keyhole. I frowned, twirled the key, and tried again. To no avail. The keyhole was new, a different shape. My key didn't even come close. I rang the doorbell, feeling oddly awkward about ringing the doorbell of my own house. No one answered. I rang again, longer. At least Cody had to be inside. He usually didn't leave the house until 3 when he met up with friends at the mall. There was still no answer. Going around the house, I tried the back door, but even there, I was in for a surprise. A new lock, shiny and impregnable. I knocked on the kitchen window, but the curtains were drawn. Another novelty. I always left the kitchen curtains open during the day to let the sunlight in. With growing unease, I returned to the porch and sat down on the bench Delbert and I had put up the year of our silver wedding. Grocery bags stood at my feet. One of them contained ice cream, vanilla, and chocolate chip, Shayla's favorite treat. It was melting in the July heat. I'd been waiting for almost an hour when I heard the familiar squeak of brakes as Roy's pickup pulled up. He looked surprised to see me on the porch. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "I can't get in the house," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They changed the locks." Roy pulled a bunch of keys out of his pocket, new shiny keys. "Oh, yeah, sorry, I forgot to tell you. Me and the guys decided to upgrade the locks. Security reasons, you know. 2 houses were burglarized last month on the next street over." He spoke casually, as if he was talking about rearranging furniture or changing curtains, not about the fact that I was actually locked out of my own house. "Why didn't you give me a new key?" I asked, rising from the bench. My legs were stiff from sitting so long. "I got caught up in the moment." Roy shrugged, unlocking the door. "Come on in, I'll make you a copy." The house was cool and smelled sweet. In the kitchen, I found Debbie spreading fresh baked goods on my best dish. "Oh, there you are," she said instead of greeting me. "We're having guests tonight, so we're going to need the living room." "Guests?" I asked, absent-mindedly starting to sort through my shopping bags. "My book club." Debbie didn't even look at me. "We meet every second Thursday of the month. Last time it was Marjorie's, and now it's my turn. I didn't know Debbie had a book club. In the 2 months we'd been living together, I'd never seen her read anything but celebrity magazines. Okay, I said quietly. I can sit in my room. Actually, Debbie finally turned to me. I was thinking maybe you could go out. We need space, and your room is, you know, you'd have to go to the bathroom through it. It's gonna be uncomfortable. I froze with a can of canned peaches in my hand. You're asking me to leave my own house? Just for a couple hours. Debbie turned back to her baking again. 6 to 9, 10 tops. Don't make a tragedy of it. Roy walked into the kitchen, looking through some papers as he went. Here you go. He handed me the key. But Mom, don't give it to anyone, okay? And if you lose it, tell me right away. These locks have secrets. You can't just duplicate them. I took the key, feeling its wrong alien weight in the palm of my hand. Roy, your wife wants me out of the house tonight. Oh, yeah, book club. He nodded, as if that explained everything. Go to the movies or to your friend. What's her? Nora? You like to have tea with her. This is my house, I said, and my voice shook. I've paid for it for 30 years. Come on, Ma. Roy put his hand on my shoulder. It's only for a couple hours. Be a team player. A team player. Like we were playing a game, not deciding if I had a right to be in my own house. At 5 o'clock, Debbie's guests began to arrive. They were 5 women about her age, loud, with bright lipstick and jingling bracelets. I didn't notice a book on any of them. They had brought bottles of wine and some boxes of board games, though. I sat in my room, listening to them set up in the living room, moving furniture around and turning on music. When I stepped outside to get a glass of water, Debbie intercepted me in the hallway. You're still here? She sounded irritated. We were supposed to be discussing personal matters. I was just getting water, I said, trying to squeeze past her toward the kitchen. Debbie didn't budge. Clara, we had a deal. Why do you always have to make everything so complicated? I could feel my cheeks burning. I'm not complicating things. I just want to get some water from my kitchen. Jesus, take your water and go. Debbie rolled her eyes. Just be quick and don't go into the living room. I slipped into the kitchen, feeling the stares of her friends on me. They fell silent as I entered, and I heard one of them whisper, "Who the hell is that?" My mother-in-law, the other replied with a tone like it was about some kind of illness. As I poured the water, I noticed my car keys lying on the table. Roy must have taken the Honda again without asking. It had become a habit. He would just take my car when his pickup was out of tune, as he put it. I went back to my room, closing the door tightly. The music was getting louder and louder, the laughter and conversations overpowering even the TV, which I had turned on to provide some distraction. At 6:30, there was a knock on the door. Grandma, it was Shayla. Mommy says you have to go. I opened the door. My granddaughter stood leaning against the door jamb, phone in hand, not even looking at me. Shayla, I'm not going anywhere. This is my house. Who cares? She shrugged. Just take a walk somewhere before 10. Big deal. It's my house, I repeated. I paid for it. Okay, Boomer. Shayla rolled her eyes, just like her mother had a few minutes ago. Mom said if you don't leave, they'll move the party to your room and they'll send you to the attic. She said it without a shadow of irony or sympathy, just relaying the information. Then she turned and walked away without waiting for my response. I stood there, staring after her, feeling something heavy and hot inside. It wasn't really anger. I'd long since forgotten how to be angry, more like a deep, burning humiliation. A few minutes later, Debbie came into my room without knocking, followed by Roy. Mom, what kind of daycare is this? Roy began. We're just asking you to give us a couple hours. For a book club with no books? I was surprised at my own audacity. It's none of your business what the book club is with, Debbie said. We're entitled to our privacy. In my house. Look. Debbie crossed her arms over her chest. We've lived here for almost 3 months. We have rights too. You can't be so selfish. Mom, Roy sat down on the edge of the bed. You always said that family is the most important thing. Well, we're your family, and we're asking you for a favor. Why is that so hard? I looked at them, at my son, who was no longer the boy I knew, and at the woman who thought I was a nuisance in my own home. All right, I said quietly. I'll leave. I packed the essentials, a toothbrush, a nightgown, blood pressure pills. For some reason, I put a framed picture of Delbert in my bag, the only one still in my room. All the others had long since moved to the attic with the other unnecessary things. As I walked through the living room, no one even turned their heads. 6 women sat around my coffee table, which held bottles of wine and plates of appetizers. One of them put her shoe-clad feet on the couch, the same couch I cleaned every week with a special brush. It was still light outside, but the evening chill was already being felt. I slowly made my way down the porch, feeling incredibly old. Where to go? To the movies like Roy suggested? Ridiculous. I couldn't remember the last time I'd been to a movie theater. Probably when Delbert was alive. My feet carried me across the street to Nora Haywood's house. We'd been friends for 15 years, ever since she'd moved to our street after her husband died. Nora was 6 years younger than me, energetic, with short gray hair and a habit of calling things by their proper names. She opened the door before I could ring the bell. Been watching your house? She said instead of greeting me. What kind of circus did they have going on up there? Book club, I answered, and I could hear the bitterness in my voice. No books by the looks of it. Nora snorted. Come in. I have brandy, and I think we're going to need it tonight. We sat on her back porch, watching the sun set behind the treetops. Nora poured me a brandy just half a glass, but it was enough to keep me warm. I told her about the new locks, about the demand to leave my own house, about Shayla's threat to my mother. They're surviving you, Nora said bluntly, and you're letting them. What can I do? He's my son. So what? That's a reason to wipe your feet? I didn't say anything. All my life I've tried to be a good mother, a good wife, a good person. Don't cause trouble, my mother used to say. Be compliant, my mother-in-law advised me in the early years of my marriage to Delbert, and I followed that advice, yielding, adapting, accepting other people's needs as more important than my own. The house is yours, Nora continued. You paid for it, not them. Roy says family comes first. He brings that up conveniently, Nora snorted. Where was family when you needed help after your surgery last year? I didn't see him here every day. She was right. When I had knee surgery, Roy visited me in the hospital once with a hastily bought bouquet. Then he disappeared for 2 weeks, citing a work emergency in a neighboring state. Nora brought me food, helped me clean, and even drove me to physical therapy 3 times a week. You can stay at my place, Nora said, filling my glass. The guest room is always ready. I thanked her and tried to smile, but something clenched inside at the thought of being homeless in my own city. When it got dark, we moved into the living room. Nora turned on the TV, but neither of us watched. I thought about my house across the street, where strangers were now occupying my space, drinking from my glasses, eating off my plates. About Roy, who had let his wife kick me out. About Debbie, who treated me like an annoying old piece of furniture that couldn't be thrown away, but could be pushed into a corner. You know, Nora said, my cousin Wesley is a real estate lawyer. Maybe you should talk to him. Why? I honestly didn't understand. Because it's your house, and you have every right to evict them if you want to. Evict my own son? I shook my head. No, I can't. Why not? Because that's not the way it's done? Because what people will say? Nora leaned toward me. What about how you feel? Does that make a difference? I didn't answer. Do my feelings matter? No one had asked me that in the last 3 months, not even myself. At night, lying in Nora's guest room, I stared at the ceiling and thought about my friend's words. The stars were visible through the window, bright, distant, indifferent to human problems. Somewhere out there, among those stars, was Delbert. What would he say when he saw how his son treated his widow? I remembered how Delbert and I had picked out the lot for the house, how we saved every penny, denying ourselves even the little things. How I kept saving after his death, working overtime, moonlighting on weekends. 30 years of sacrifice and compromise for a roof over my head, my roof, my home. And now I was lying in someone else's bed, kicked out of my own home like an unwanted guest. Something was rising up inside me, a feeling I hadn't felt in years. Not just resentment or disappointment. No, it was real, burning rage. A rage that made my fists clench and my breathing quicken. A rage that demanded action, not humility. I clenched the key to the new lock in my fist, the one Roy had condescendingly handed me. For the first time in a long time, I felt ready to fight, not to give in, not to adapt, not to take someone else's will for granted. The morning was overcast. I woke up in Nora's guest room, not immediately remembering where I was. Heavy clouds hung low outside the window, promising rain. "How did you sleep?" Nora asked when I came down to the kitchen. "Not so good," I admitted, taking the cup of coffee from her hands. "I called Wesley. He's expecting us at 11. I almost choked." "You called already? Why wait?" Nora shrugged. "The sooner you start, the sooner you'll solve the problem." Wesley Bishop's office was in an old brick building in the downtown area. I'd been here once, years ago, when Delbert and I signed the papers to buy the property. Wesley had been a young professional just starting out. Now there was a sign on the door, Bishop and Associates, Legal Services. Wesley got up from his desk to greet us. He had changed a lot, gray hair, fat, but his eyes were still as lively and attentive as ever. I told him everything, how Roy and his family had shown up on my doorstep temporarily, how they'd gradually taken over more and more of the space, the locks that had been replaced, and how I'd been kicked out of my own home. "Mrs. Winslow," he asked when I had finished, "do you still have the deeds to the house and lot?" I shook my head. "They're in the house, in the safe in my bedroom." "That presents some difficulties." Wesley frowned. "But I should still have copies. Let's check." He turned to the computer and started looking for something. After a few minutes, he nodded in satisfaction. "Here it is. Transaction dated June 25th, 1999. The lot at 24 Oak Street. The buyers are Delbert and Clara Winslow." Wesley turned the monitor so I could see a scan of the old deed with our signatures on it. When I saw my husband's handwriting, I felt my heart sink. "According to these documents," Wesley continued, "the land is all yours, Clara. When Delbert died, you became the sole owner." "But the house," I began. "The house is an interesting situation." Wesley tapped his finger on the screen. "The house wasn't there when you bought the lot. You built it later, didn't you?" "Yeah, a year after I bought the lot." "And did you file separate paperwork for the structure?" "I'm trying to remember." Delbert handled all the formalities. I remember we went to the city hall, got building permits. "I'll look in the archives." Wesley nodded. "But even if the house was deeded to both of them, when Delbert died, his share went to you. Unless there was a will with other instructions." "There wasn't." I shook my head. "Delbert died suddenly, a heart attack." "Then by law, you inherit the entire property as a spouse," Wesley confirmed. "Both the land and the house legally belong to you." "But then why can her son behave like that?" Nora intervened. "Unfortunately, such family situations are not uncommon." Wesley sighed. Often parents let their adult children live temporarily, and then they actually take over the house. It's technically illegal, but many parents don't want to sue their own children. I don't want to sue Roy, I confirmed. He's my son, no matter what. I understand, Wesley nodded, but sometimes the threat of a lawsuit can make a person come to their senses. Let's do it this way. I'll prepare a formal notice for your son and his family. It will state that they are illegally occupying your property and must vacate it within 30 days, or a lawsuit will follow. 30 days? I questioned. That's so long. That's the standard notice period, Wesley explained. The law gives people a chance to find a new place to live, but if they don't move out in that time, we'll file a lawsuit to force them out. I pictured handing Roy the official paper, explaining to my grandchildren that I'm kicking them out of the house. What would the neighbors say? What would Leslie, my youngest daughter, think? I need to think, I said quietly. As we left the office, it began to rain. Nora opened her umbrella and we hurried to the car. I can't do this, I said as we got into the car. I can't kick my own son out. But he kicked you out, Nora reminded me, from your own house. I know, but, it's Roy, my boy. Clara, your boy has been a man for 42 years, and he's been acting like the last scoundrel. We drove through the wet streets, and I stared out the window, remembering when Delbert and I had picked out the lot. It was spring. The trees were just turning their first green. Delbert walked the empty lot, marking out the steps of the future house. This is where we'll have the living room. This is where we'll have the kitchen. And over there, under the big oak tree, we'll have a backyard barbecue. We were saving every penny. I got a second job working in the evenings 3 times a week at the library, shelving books. Delbert took overtime at the factory. We denied ourselves everything. No restaurants, no new TV, no new dresses and suits. $10 a month. That's how much I saved in the bank where I worked during the day. Sometimes I was able to put away more if there were bonuses or gifts from relatives. Every dollar brought us closer to our dream of owning our own home. When we finally saved enough for a down payment and the bank approved the mortgage, Delbert and I opened a bottle of champagne, the only one we'd had all year. We drank from plastic cups, sitting right on the ground of our future backyard. This is the beginning of a new life, Delbert said then, putting his arm around my shoulders. And now that house had become a stranger's house. It was inhabited by people who had no respect for my labor or my feelings. There was no one at home. My new key fit the lock, and I walked into the hallway, feeling strange, like an intruder in my own home. The living room was a mess after last night's book club empty bottles, chipped crumbs on the carpet, someone's forgotten earrings on the coffee table. I walked to my bedroom and opened the safe hidden in the back of the closet. It held all the important documents: marriage certificate, children's birth certificates, insurance policies, and, of course, the deeds to the house and lot. Spreading them out on the bed, I scrutinized each one. Wesley was right. After Delbert died, I was the sole owner of both the land and the house. All the taxes were paid, all the paperwork in order. I gathered up the papers and put them in my bag. Now they would always be with me, not in the house, where I couldn't go without permission. At that moment, the front door slammed, and I heard Roy and Debbie's voices. "She wouldn't dare," Debbie was saying. "She's too soft." "I don't know." Roy's voice sounded worried. "Mom's never left like that before. I came out of the bedroom, and they stopped talking when they saw me." "Mom?" Roy looked surprised. "Are you here?" "Yes," I answered calmly. "This is my house. Look, about last night. Maybe we went a little overboard." "A little?" I raised my eyebrows. "You kicked me out of my own house." "Well, not kicked me out. Just asked me to," he stammered, seeing the look in my eyes. "Okay, I'm sorry. It won't happen again." "That's right, it won't." I confirmed, because I saw a lawyer today. Roy froze. A lawyer? Why? To learn my rights as the owner of this house and land. There was a crash in the kitchen, so Debbie must have heard us talking. What the hell? She appeared in the kitchen doorway. You're hiring a lawyer against your own son? I consulted on my property, I replied calmly, and I learned that I have every right to decide who lives in my house. That evening, Leslie, my youngest daughter, called. She lived in Oregon with her husband and children and worked as an elementary school teacher. Mom? Her voice sounded worried. What's going on? Roy called me, said you wanted to kick them out on the street. I took a deep breath. Of course Roy had called his sister. Of course he'd made it look good. Not exactly, dear, I began. I was just consulting a lawyer about the house. Why? There was genuine bewilderment in her voice. What's wrong? I told her everything about how Roy and his family were slowly taking over my house, about the new locks, about how I'd been kicked out on the street. Leslie was silent for a long time, digesting the information. That doesn't sound like Roy, she finally said. He was always so caring. People change, I sighed. Or maybe I just didn't want to see what he'd become. But an eviction, Mom? That's too drastic. Isn't there some kind of arrangement? I've tried, Leslie, many times, but they just don't listen. Look, her voice softened. I know this is hard for you, but this is a family. You can't just break up over real estate. It's not about real estate, I argued. It's about respect. It's how they treat me. I know Roy can be, complicated, but he's your son, and Cody and Shayla are your grandchildren. Do you really want to put a roof over their heads? I felt tears coming to my eyes. Leslie always had a knack for finding weaknesses. No, of course not, but I can't go on living like I'm a guest in my own home. Then talk to them, make some rules, but please don't start a lawsuit. It would destroy the family forever. The next day, Roy called me on my cell phone. Mom, we need to talk. Leslie said you two were in touch. Yes, she did, I confirmed. Look, let's get together. Just you and me. No Debbie. We'll talk like we used to. There was that note in his voice, the one that always made me give up, forgive, give in. The one that reminded me of little Roy asking for one more piece of candy before bedtime. Okay, I agreed. Where and when? Joe's, too. Wow, that's not far from your Nora's. I said yes and hung up. Nora, who had heard my part of the conversation, shook her head. He's just trying to convince you to drop the legal action. I know, I sighed, but he's my son. I have to at least listen. Well, Nora shrugged, that's your decision. But be careful. And remember that I'm on your side, no matter what happens. I hugged her, feeling immensely grateful for that support. At 67, I was relearning how to stand up for my rights. And it wouldn't have been possible without friends like Nora and the knowledge that the ground beneath my feet was truly mine. The day of the trial came unexpectedly quickly. It had been a month since I'd met Roy at Joe's. The conversation hadn't gone well then. My son had threatened me, or pressed me for pity, or promised that everything would change. But I already knew the value of his promises. Wesley had all the paperwork ready. The official eviction notice was the point of no return. I remember Debbie tearing the paper into little pieces right in front of my face, and Roy yelling that I wasn't a mother, but a heartless old woman. Cody and Shayla watched the scene silently from the top of the stairs, their faces impassive as if they were watching a boring television show. The 30 days allotted by law had expired. Roy and his family had not made a single attempt to find a new place to live. They simply ignored the situation, confident that I would give in, that motherly love would outweigh self-esteem. I almost believed it myself. But here I sit in a Yankton County courtroom, on a wooden bench, smoothing out the creases on my only formal suit. Wesley sits next to me, looking through some papers. Behind us are empty rows. No one I know has shown up. Even Nora stayed home, though she promised to be there for me. I have a migraine, she said on the phone this morning, but I could hear something else in her voice. Perhaps it seemed to her, too, that I was crossing some invisible line. The door to the hall opened and Roy and his family walked in. I hadn't seen them in 2 weeks, since I'd moved in with Nora permanently. Roy looked out of place, in a suit, his hair neatly combed. Debbie was dressed up, too, strict dress, minimal makeup. Even the children were in decent clothes, not the usual t-shirts and ripped jeans. A man in an expensive suit, their lawyer, I realized. They took the seats across the aisle from us. Roy gave me a brief glance, not angry as I'd expected, but a kind of appraising look, as if he were sizing up his chances. "Don't worry," Wesley said quietly, not lifting his eyes from the papers. "The law is completely on your side." I nodded, though deep down I knew it wasn't just about the law. We weren't suing for papers or walls. We were suing for 30 years of my life, for $10 a month, for the right to live in dignity in my own home. When the judge entered the room, everyone stood up. She was a middle-aged woman with short-cropped gray hair and an attentive gaze. She quickly familiarized herself with the case file and invited the parties to introduce themselves. Wesley spoke first, briefly summarizing the essence of the suit: unlawful occupation of a dwelling, refusal to vacate it at the request of the lawful owner, changing the locks without the owner's permission. Then Roy's lawyer, Mr. Carpenter, as he introduced himself, took the floor. "Your Honor," he began, "this is not an ordinary eviction case. This is a family situation where an elderly mother in a vulnerable state is trying to kick her own son and his family, including minor children, out of the house." I tensed up. Vulnerable condition? What does that mean? My client, Roy Winslow, and his wife, Debbie, are living with Mrs. Clara Winslow to provide her with the care and support she needs. Given her advanced age and deteriorating health, declining health, I barely restrained myself from objecting right from my seat. Wesley put a hand on my shoulder, urging me to calm down. "We have reason to believe," Carpenter continued, "that Mrs. Winslow is under the influence of third parties who are pursuing their own interests and have pushed her into this litigation. We believe that under the circumstances, it is not only morally wrong, but also against the interest of the plaintiff herself to evict a family who are caring for an elderly woman." The judge listened intently, occasionally making notes in her notebook. When Carpenter finished, she turned to Wesley. "Mr. Bishop, what do you have to say about these statements?" Wesley stood up, adjusting his glasses. "Your Honor, all these pretty words about care and support are nothing more than an attempt to divert attention from the heart of the matter. The facts speak for themselves. Mrs. Winslow is the sole owner of both the house and the land. All taxes have been paid. There are no encumbrances on the property. She has every right to decide who lives in her house." He pulled some documents out of a folder. "As for the care my colleague speaks of, let me present evidence of how things actually were. Mrs. Winslow was effectively forced out of her own home. She was not allowed to use the premises as she saw fit, and moreover, the locks were changed without her knowledge, making it impossible for her to get into her home." The judge frowned. "These are serious allegations, Mr. Bishop. Do you have evidence?" "Yes, Your Honor. We have the testimony of Mrs. Winslow's neighbor, Nora Haywood, who testifies that the plaintiff slept at her house after she couldn't get into her own home. There are also receipts for the purchase of new locks and doorknobs, made payable to Roy Winslow." Carpenter tried to object, but the judge stopped him with a gesture. "Mr. Carpenter, You claim that your clients provided necessary support to Mrs. Winslow because of her medical condition. Do you have medical documentation to support the need for such care? Counselor stammered. No, Your Honor, but Mr. Winslow is willing to testify about his mother's condition. If I may, Your Honor, Wesley interjected, we would like to clarify the plaintiff's medical condition. Mrs. Winslow is fully capable, has no diagnoses that require constant care, and was doing fine on her own until her son came into her home with the family. We have a certificate from her treating physician attesting to this. The judge reviewed the certificate and nodded. I'd like to hear both sides personally. Mr. Winslow, please take the stand to testify. Roy stood up and walked over to the witness stand. After taking the oath of office, he began to speak, tentatively at first, then increasingly emotional. Your Honor, I always took care of my mom. After my father died, she was all alone, and my wife and I tried to visit her as often as possible. When we had temporary housing difficulties, my mother offered to let us stay with her. She was glad that there was life in the house again, that her grandchildren were around. He cast a reproachful look at me. Yes, perhaps we weren't always perfect guests. We may have disrupted her routine at times, but we did it with the best of intentions. Mom had become forgetful lately, sometimes leaving the stove on, forgetting to lock the doors. That's why we decided to change the locks, for safety reasons. I listened to him with growing amazement. Forgetful? Me, who remembered the birthdays of all the neighbors on our street and never missed a bill payment? And as for that night Mom had spent the night at the neighbor's house, Roy stammered for a moment. It was a misunderstanding. Debbie had a book club. They were discussing personal topics, and we just suggested Mom spend the evening at a friend's house. No one had forbidden her to come home. Wesley stood up. Your Honor, may I ask the witness a question? The judge nodded. Mr. Winslow, did you change the locks on your mother's house without her knowledge or consent? Roy squirmed in his seat. Well, I was going to tell her. I just forgot. Yes or no? Yes, but... And you didn't give her the key to the new lock right away? I was at work when she came home. So your mother couldn't get into her own house because of your actions? Technically, yes, but... Thank you. I have no further questions. Wesley sat back down. Carpenter tried to remedy the situation by asking Roy leading questions about how he and Debbie helped me around the house, how they kept me healthy, how the grandchildren brightened my loneliness. Roy answered more and more confidently, painting a picture of a caring family and a cranky old lady who suddenly decided to kick them out into the street. When it was my turn to testify, I could feel my knees trembling. I had never testified in court before. After taking the oath of office, I sat down and looked around the room. Roy was staring at the floor. Debbie was whispering in the lawyer's ear. The kids were on their phones. Mrs. Winslow, the judge turned to me. Please tell me your version of events. I took a deep breath and began to speak. About how Roy had called and asked to stay for a couple weeks. How those weeks turned into months, about how I was gradually being forced out of my own home, first from the living room, then the closet, then even my bedroom when Debbie decided they needed more room for things. Told of the locks replaced, of the book club, of the humiliation I felt when I had to leave my own home at my sister-in-law's request. About how Roy had commandeered my car without asking, how my grandchildren had shown no respect whatsoever. I love my son, I said, feeling my voice shake. I loved him from the moment I first held him in my arms in the maternity ward. I loved him when he was knee-breaking and when he broke my heart with his actions. I love him now, sitting here, but I can no longer let him and his family treat me like an unwanted thing. This is my home. I've been saving for it for 30 years, putting away $10 a month. I worked double shifts to pay the mortgage. It's the only thing I have, and I want to spend the rest of my life in my home, in peace and respect. There was silence in the hall. I could see the judge looking at me intently, Wesley nodding approvingly, Roy sitting with his shoulders slumped. Carpenter asked me a few questions, trying to catch me at inconsistencies, alluding to my forgetfulness and emotional instability. But I answered clearly and calmly, not giving in to provocation. When all the testimony had been given, the judge called a recess for a decision. Wesley and I went out into the hallway. Roy and his family remained at the other end of the hall, talking to the lawyer. "You were great," Wesley said, sincere and to the point. "I think the judge is on our side." I nodded, unable to speak. The tension of the last few weeks, the sleepless nights, the fear of this day, it all came at once, and I felt drained. 20 minutes later, we were called back into the courtroom. The judge was already in her seat, with the documents in front of her. After reviewing all the evidence presented and hearing the testimony of the parties, the court makes the following decision, she said measuredly, looking alternately at me and Roy. The claims of Clara Winslow are granted in full to recognize Clara Winslow as the sole legal owner of the real property at 24 Oak Street. Order Roy Winslow, Deborah Kress, and their minor children to vacate said residential property within 14 days from the date of judgment. She paused, looking at Roy and Debbie. The court also finds it necessary to point out that the defendant's behavior toward the plaintiff was intolerable, changing the locks without the owner's knowledge, restricting access to the dwelling, moral pressure. All this is a violation not only of moral and ethical norms, but also of the law. The judge collected the papers. The decision can be appealed in due course. The meeting was closed. She stood up and left the hall. I sat there without moving, not believing it was over. Wesley shook my hand. "Congratulations, Clara. You've won." I nodded, feeling neither joy nor relief, just tiredness and a strange emptiness inside. Roy stood up and walked over to us. His face was white with anger. "Are you satisfied?" he asked quietly. "Kicked her own son out on the street. Mother of the Year." "Roy," I began, but he interrupted. "Don't bother. It's all said. We'll move out in 2 days. We won't wait until you're 14. You can enjoy your victory." He turned and walked toward the exit. Debbie threw me a scornful look and followed him. Cody and Shayla walked past without even glancing in my direction. "Don't take it personally," Wesley said, seeing my state of mind. "They're angry now, but they'll get better in time." I knew he was wrong. Something had broken in that courtroom today, and no amount of time could glue the pieces together. As I walked out of the courthouse, I saw Nora. She was waiting for me at the entrance, smoking nervously, a habit she'd kicked 10 years ago. "I'm sorry I didn't come," she said, hugging me. "I couldn't. How did it go?" "I won," I answered, my voice sounding hollow. "That's good," Nora nodded, but her eyes knew that I had lost something far more important than the right to 4 walls and a roof. We walked down the street, and I thought about what lay ahead. An empty house, no laughing grandchildren, no morning conversations with my son over a cup of coffee. Holiday calls that would grow shorter and more formal until they stopped altogether. Leslie, who will never forgive me for this trial, even if she pays lip service to saying she understands. I won my house, but I lost my family, and standing on the courthouse steps, in a moment of triumph, I wondered for the first time, was it worth it? Roy and his family did move out after 2 days. They took their belongings, leaving the house in total disarray. Broken furniture, holes in the walls from nails, stains on the carpets. It was like a farewell thank you for 30 years of motherhood. When I entered the empty house, I was greeted by a silence so deep it made my ears ring. I walked slowly around the rooms, noting the signs of their presence. the scratches on the parquet from moving furniture, the curtains darkened by cigarette smoke, the chips on the kitchen countertop. In Shayla's room, there was a sticker on the wall, a silhouette of some pop star. In Cody's room, the smell of teenage cologne, too pungent and clingy. In the living room, the stain of spilled wine on the couch Delbert and I had chosen so carefully. I stood in the middle of my home, which was once again mine alone, and realized that no legal victory could bring back what had been destroyed. The ground beneath my feet was mine again, but the feeling of emptiness inside suggested that the price of that victory was prohibitive. Fall came early to Yankton. Already in mid-September, the trees on Oak Street were yellow and red, and in the mornings the grass was silvery with hoarfrost. It had been 3 months since the day I won the lawsuit and got my house back. 3 months of silence and loneliness. I sat on the porch, wrapped in Delbert's old blanket, watching the leaves fall from the maple tree we'd planted 30 years ago. Then it was a thin sapling, barely reaching my shoulder. Now it's a mighty tree that shadows half the yard. So much time has passed. So much had changed. After Roy and his family left, the first thing I'd done was change the locks now on my own, deliberately. Nora helped me find a craftsman who replaced not only the locks, but also reinforced the doors. For safety, she said. But we both knew I wasn't afraid of burglars, but of my son's return. Afraid and hopeful at the same time that he would come back, apologizing, wanting to make things right. But Roy didn't. According to Nora, he and Debbie and the children left for Des Moines, where Debbie had a sister. No parting words, no contact. It was as if that family had never existed in my life. I spent the first weeks after they left cleaning and renovating. The house needed it. There were signs of neglect everywhere, stains on the wallpaper, scratches on the furniture. I painted the walls, changed curtains, scrubbed away embedded dirt. Physical work helped me not to think, not to feel. I decided to turn Cody's room into a guest room. Light-colored wallpaper, a new dresser, clean linens, always ready for the guests who never came. I made Shayla's room my study, with a desk and a collection of books I'd kept in the attic. Now I spent evenings there, reading or just staring out the window at the quiet street. The house was clean and tidy again, all things in their places, all surfaces gleaming, not a speck of dust anywhere. The perfect order I'd longed for all those months of living with Roy's family, except it didn't feel good. On the contrary, it emphasized emptiness, lifelessness, absence. Leslie stopped calling right after the trial. I tried to contact her several times, but to no avail. In the last conversation, she said I would have to choose between home and family. I replied that it wasn't about the house, it was about respect. "What difference does it make?" she asked and hung up. We never spoke again. For Thanksgiving, which has always been a family holiday, I was alone. I cooked a turkey, a small one for one person, set the table in the living room. White tablecloths, my best china, silverware. I sat in front of this wealth, feeling neither the taste of food nor the smell of my favorite spices, only emptiness inside and out. I pulled out the photo albums that had been stored in the attic all these months. I flipped through the pages, looking at snapshots from years past. Here's Roy at 5 years old on his first bike, grinning ear to ear, knees knocked together. Here's Leslie in her prom dress, serious, straight-backed, so much like me in my youth. Here we are all together at a picnic by the lake. Delbert is still alive. The kids are small. Everyone is happy. What happened to that family? When did things start to fall apart? Maybe while Delbert was still alive, who had always been the bridge between me and the kids. Or later, when Roy married Debbie, and I was never able to truly accept her. Or more recently, when I'd put my dignity above the bonds of family. I remembered Delbert's words shortly before he died. Family isn't walls, Clara. Family is about people. I had agreed with him then. Now I had walls, but no people. And that realization made it unbearably painful. Nora came by almost every day, bringing pies, news, her unfailing involvement. She never said, "I warned you," or "You made the right choice." She was just there for me when I needed someone alive in this dead house. "Why don't you go and see Leslie?" She suggested it one day over a cup of tea. On your own, unannounced. Sometimes it's easier to talk face to face. I shook my head. She wouldn't want to see me. She blames me for everything that's happened. "Do you blame yourself?" Nora asked, looking me straight in the eye. I didn't answer. What could I say? That I replay the events in my head every night, trying to figure out where I could have done things differently? That I wake up from dreams where Roy is little and calling me mommy and I can't reach him? That I was mentally dialoguing endlessly with Debbie, trying to explain to her why I couldn't take it anymore? It snowed for Christmas. White, fluffy, world-transforming snow. I pulled boxes of decorations out of the attic like I did every year. I hung a wreath on the door, put candles on the windowsills. I even bought a small Christmas tree and decorated it with old toys, many of which the children had made with their own hands. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, as the snowflakes slowly swirled outside the window, I sat by the fireplace and looked through Christmas cards from years past. One caught my eye, a homemade one with an unevenly cut Christmas tree and a crooked inscription, "To the best mom in the world." Roy had made it in third grade. Back then, he still believed I was the best. Back then, I still believed I could always protect him, always be there for him. I pulled out my phone and dialed Roy's number, not really hoping for an answer. To my surprise, after the third ring, the phone picked up. "Hello?" Shayla's voice, wary, unsure. "Shayla? It's Grandma." Silence. I could hear her breathing, some sounds in the background. "Hello, Grandmother," she said at last, without any warmth, but without obvious hostility. "Merry Christmas, dear," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "How are you? How's Cody?" "Fine," she answered after a pause. "We're at a new school. It's different. And Dad and Mom? Dad's at work. He's got a job at a car service. Mom's home cooking dinner." Silence again. I didn't know what else to say. Should I ask if they'd gotten my gifts from the online store? Ask if they missed the old house? Me? "Shayla, will you please tell your dad and Mom that I hesitated to find the words, that I'm thinking of you, that the doors of my house are always open to you." "Uh-huh," she said indifferently. "Well, I gotta go. Bye, Grandma." And she hung up without waiting for me to answer. I sat there, holding the phone to my ear, as if her voice were still there, as if the connection hadn't been cut off. In January, Leslie called. Brief, formal, asked how I was doing, told me about my kids. She didn't mention Roy or the trial or anything that had happened. She spoke as if there hadn't been a 3-month silence between us, as if everything was fine. At the end of the conversation, she promised to call more often. I knew that wasn't going to happen, but I thanked her, at least for trying. In February, Nora went into the hospital with pneumonia. I visited her every day, bringing her homemade soup and fresh magazines. I sat by her bedside, holding her hand. In these moments, I felt my loneliness especially keenly. The only person close to me was under an IV, and blood relatives were far away, and not just physically. "You have to call Roy," Nora said one day when she was feeling better. "Otherwise, you're going to live like strangers." "We are strangers," I said. He made it clear he didn't want to see me. "Nonsense," Nora coughed. "He's your son. You're his mother. That doesn't change because of some judgment or resentment." Maybe she was right, But every time I thought about the call, I remembered Roy's face in the courtroom, his words, Mother of the Year, and my hand dropped without dialing. In early March, I got a letter from Leslie, a real paper letter, stamped and postmarked. Inside was a picture of her children, my grandchildren, whom I hadn't seen in over a year, and a short note, Mom, they miss you. We all miss you. L. I stared at the photo for a long time, at those smiling faces, so similar and yet different. They had grown up, changed. I missed this year of their lives, just as I will miss the next if nothing changes. I wrote back a long emotional letter explaining everything that had happened, asking them to understand me, telling them of my love for them all. For 3 days, I wrote, rewrote, put it off, started again. In the end, I sent only a short note. I miss you too. Come visit when you can. Always your mom. I don't know if she got it. There was no reply. By April, the pain had dulled. It wasn't completely gone, but it became something familiar, background. I learned to live with it the way one lives with a chronic illness, not noticing most of the time, but sometimes, in moments of weakness, buckling from an acute attack. In mid-April, when nature had already awakened from its winter slumber and the first tulips were blooming in my garden, I sat on my porch, breathing in the fresh spring air. The day was warm, sunny, one of those days when it seems that life is beautiful after all, no matter what. The house behind me was clean, well maintained, completely mine. I could arrange things however I wanted, cook whatever I wanted, come and go whenever I wanted. No one touched my stuff, no loud music, no loud friends brought over. Total freedom and independence. What I had dreamed of all those months of living together with Roy and his family, and yet, sitting there in the halo of spring sunshine, I felt infinitely lonely. The house, so coveted, so longed for, now seemed too big, too empty, too quiet. The echo of footsteps in the empty rooms, the creak of floorboards with no one to listen but me, the ticking of the old clock that measured the time I would spend alone. I thought about Roy where he was now, how he was coping, whether he sometimes remembered our home, our breakfasts together, those rare moments when we were a real family. I thought about Debbie, who I never got to love, but who was part of my son's life, the mother of my grandchildren. Thought of Cody and Shayla, who grew up without a grandmother, without the connection to the past that I could give them. Thought about Leslie, who tried to build a bridge between us but couldn't because the chasm was too wide. About the grandchildren in Oregon who sent drawings for Christmas but didn't really know me. And sitting there, in my perfectly clean house on my perfectly manicured street, I asked myself the question I'd been putting off all these months. Was it worth it? Was standing up for my own dignity, my own space, my own rules worth the price I had to pay? A price in the form of broken relationships, lost family, lonely days, and even lonelier nights? I didn't know the answer. Maybe I never will. Maybe it just doesn't exist. The right answer to a question where both sides of the equation contain loss.